The Carleton College Convocation program is a weekly lecture series that brings fresh insights and perspectives from experts in a variety of fields. The program has a rich history dating back several decades. The selected convocation speakers assist the liberal arts mission of centering thoughtful conversations within education and beyond.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Samara.
And my name is Sammy, and we're both senior political science majors, thrilled to be here today to introduce our distinguished speaker. It's our honor to welcome Dr. Lawrence R. Jacobs, a preeminent scholar of American political science, especially renowned for his work on public opinion and its influence on public policy and political outcomes. Dr. Jacobs is the founder and director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota. He was appointed the Walter F. and Joan Mondale Chair for Political Studies at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs in 2005 and holds the McKnight Presidential Chair. In recognition of his contributions to political science, Dr. Jacobs was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2020. Over the course of his prolific career, Dr. Jacobs has written or edited 17 books and over 100 scholarly articles, covering a range of topics including American democracy, national and state elections, political communications, healthcare reform, and economic inequality.
His latest book, Democracy Under Fire, Donald Trump and the Breaking of American History, explores 250 years of American politics, delivering an insightful yet severe indictment on our political system and how it led us to this point. In this book, Dr. Jacobs investigates the historical dynamics of America's party system, contending that these forces have gradually eroded democracy, deepened political and racial inequalities, and fueled detrimental political polarization. He suggests methods to curb the unchecked ambition of politicians who exploit division while fostering widespread citizen involvement in meaningful policy development. As young citizens, we know that today, like every day since the election, is not free from fear for the state of our country or immensely personal concerns for what our lives may look like for the next 4 years. Yet, as political scientists, we know the value of candid conversations grounded in truth and pragmatism in transforming these feelings into actions. We could not be more fortunate to have an expert like Dr. Jacobs here with us today to speak on both the complexities and the fault lines of American democracy, especially during such a pivotal time. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Lawrence R. Jacobs to Carleton College.
It's great to be here. I wish I could say I traveled far and wide, but of course, I drove down from Twin Cities this morning. I went to Oberlin College and feel a great kinship with Carleton. In some ways, very similar places in terms of their intellectual seriousness, and a place that really shaped me to my core. Also, by the way, I met my wife there in a freshman English class. And we now both are professors at the University of Minnesota. So there's that. I want to talk about the state of democracy, but I want to kind of enter this in a slightly different way. There was a lot of fear moving into the 2024 election. The election would be stolen, that it would be disrupted, perhaps by violent groups, or votes wouldn't be counted. None of that happened. And it turned out to be a very close election. Donald Trump won by plurality, and when you look closely, he prevailed really by a bit more than 200,000 votes in the 3 key states of Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin. So here you had a close election, and it was well run. There may have been some issues, but it didn't affect the outcome. And I think we can all be grateful for that. But we have some very significant, I would say almost existential threats to our democracy, and that's what I want to talk about today, what I would describe as the disfigurement of our institutions. And we often kind of get distracted when we look at the personalities or the big issues, but I want us today to be serious and look at the institutions and their rules and their procedures And that's the journey I'm going to take us in. Now, just to, kind of clear the election, not a surprise. This was a quite predictable outcome. We saw, as we have for a number of years, that those who identify with the Democratic and Republican parties voted that way. And so when Kamala Harris is campaigning with Liz Cheney and trying to win over Republicans, those of us who study voting chuckled and said this was foolhardy. It was. Over 95% of Republicans continue to vote for the Republican Party candidate, as they have in the past. Similar numbers on the Democratic side. So that's one factor here, which is the kind of pull of party. It really locks in, to 3/4 or more of the electorate. The other part is that voters are making decisions based on their judgment of how things were going, particularly in the economy. And as we look through the exit polls, what we see is that those who thought that their own personal financial situation was worse, or that they had experienced severe or moderate hardship, they voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. Now, we refer to this as retrospective voting, and it's something that helped to elect Joe Biden in 2020, narrowly, even more narrowly than Donald Trump's election in 2024. So these patterns are not new. They're kind of plain vanilla. And so the outcome of the election is not really much of a story. Of course, my colleagues and I will spend a lot of time investigating it and publishing articles, and I'm sure you're thrilled to know that. But the actual general contours of it, not surprising. But there is something that is very important about this election that I want us to focus on, which is Donald Trump's nomination. This is an extraordinary development, and one that I would say is quite apart from what we would see among our allies that have democratic political systems. So for instance, in Europe, as in elsewhere, the political parties control who is nominated. So if you look at the elections in Great Britain this summer, both political parties and their leaderships made decisions about who would be nominated that excluded major political figures. Jeremy Corbyn, who had been the leader of the Labour Party, but was also a Trotskyite who was opposed to the current Labour Party leader, he was not nominated. It's kind of an extraordinary thing. And similarly, prominent figures were not nominated by the Conservative Party. So, this is a striking contrast with the U.S., in which we see the parties exercising control over who is nominated based on support for their party's policy agenda, for their leadership, and concern about the extremism of the candidates. The U.S., no, this is not our pattern. The party leadership have no real control over who is nominated, and I'm going to be talking about that. So why do I describe Donald Trump as extraordinary as a nominee? Again, it's not extraordinary that he was elected. In my view, that is entirely legitimate and an important function of our democratic system, to have accountability that give voters a chance to change who's in control. But here's what's extraordinary about Donald Trump. He's not a member of the Republican Party until quite recently. This is very weird. And Europeans, when I travel abroad, they're like, wait, why is Donald Trump the nominee? Is he even in the Republican Party? I'm like, yeah, I think he is now, but yeah, it's true. He donated to the Clintons and supported Democratic candidates for years and wasn't really aligned with either party. He rejects the core policy agenda of the Republican Party on trade, national security, entitlement reform, and his immigration policy is quite a variance with what we've seen prior Republican president's support. So for instance, both Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush supported quite significant reforms of immigration to make it more available. And then we saw, something we've not really seen before, where the top echelons of the Republican Party, of the military structure, of economic leaders, all came out and declared before the 2024 nomination battle that Donald Trump was not fit for office. This is not something we see in other countries, but we have in the U.S. So, where are we going? Well, I want to turn to U.S. history, and I want to try to explain to you how we've gotten to this point where the parties in the U.S. have no control over who's nominated, and why that has been a concern for over a century, and why it should be a concern for us today. And the starting point is going to be the 1780s. So we are really going back in time, and this is going to be a whirlwind tour. Luckily, we can go back and forwards, and glad to address questions. I'm going to point to three critical junctures that weakened what were intended to be filters on the rise of demagogues and extremists in American political power. Okay. And then we'll talk about some of the consequences for today. And I want to be just clear, because people often, my students will do this all the time. Which party is he in? Is he a radical left? I've had students say, no, he's actually a radical right-leaner. I don't want to disappoint anyone, but I'm neither. And actually, I think, having worked on this project for some time, it's anchored in a more traditional conservative orientation with institutions and foundational values. So my comments are not that of a partisan. And as you'll see, I place Democrats as fully culpable in the dire situation we find ourselves today. Hamilton, what a great play. How many of you have seen Hamilton? Awesome, right? My kids have all gone out and bought the CD. Well, no one has CD, but now they have it on their Spotify and others. And I have to admit that I always look for opportunities to put some of the songs in my lectures. Sometimes it doesn't really fit the lecture, but I just love the music. And it wakes everybody up in class to have, some of the great music from the play. It's terrible history, though. It's terrible history. The real hero, or the key figure in the founding period of the U.S. is James Madison. And he is seen as the father of the Constitution, and particularly the American form of political representation. I want to talk about that a little bit. Declaration of Independence, 1776. It said some radical things, including the fact that citizens would have inalienable rights, that there would be popular consent. These were really extraordinary ideas. It helped to spur the French Revolution, and in the U.S. it was really taken to heart. Many laborers and sailors and farmers who had not been part of the political process heard about these rights and were like, gee, that sounds pretty good. And they started to run for office, and they were nominated, and then they were elected. And so the character of American politics after the Declaration in 1776 was very vibrant, particularly in the state legislatures of the Confederation that existed at that point. Now, as this was going on, James Madison, who was he was a punk. He was a punk from Princeton, very young guy, who was starting to gather with others who had real concerns about what was going on. Madison and Hamilton and Jefferson and others described the evils from what they saw as excess democracy. They were particularly skeptical about this upsurge of people being in politics and the importance of popular majorities. Jefferson warned of elective despotism. Ooh. They were also very concerned about what they saw as the defect of statesmen, meaning those who were being elected to office. This was a source of evil because the virtue that would identify what was in the best interests of the country, that would be a protector of the public good and private rights, was at risk. So there was a real concern about what are we going to do about this excessive democracy going on in the US. Now Madison is kind of this leader of the convention that designs the Constitution in 1787 in Philadelphia. Very hot. I don't know how many of you know Philadelphia summers. Not pleasant. And just imagine sitting in a wooden, relatively small wooden room with latrines just outside the window. And that begins to give you a flavor of the kind of what was going on here. So the convention meets, and it was authorized by the state legislatures in the Confederation. But they had no idea what Madison had planned. It was a secret. What the state legislatures had been sold on was kind of, we're going to do some tinkering to make sure trade is easier. We're going to talk about common defense among these independent states. But Madison and this small group that got together had something totally different in mind. And they really created a new national government. It was a radical, radical departure from what had existed. One of the core parts of this new form of government, national government, was to create a check on democracy, to insulate government officials, to weed out the extremists who would try to ply their trade by appealing to the people. And we're going to see this kind of, the use of a kind of appeals to the people is a theme in America and elsewhere. One part of it was, of this effort by Madison and his colleagues, was to shift to a scheme of representation, that there would be a small number who would be delegated to represent a larger number. And this was seen to be articulating the consent of the governed that was talked about in the Declaration, but it was also seen as a way to filter the more extremist elements in the country. So when you have laborers talking about a Robin Hood dividend to provide relief to farmers, Madison and others were saying, yeah, let's use this scheme of representation to filter out those populists. The other part was filtration. And there were a lot of ways in which that was done, including through the scheme of representation, but some examples would be the Electoral College. This was deliberately intended, though not enacted this way, to filter out the popular view. If the voters had decided to support a dangerous demagogue, then the electors were expected to exercise their own independent judgment. This has not happened. But it's created other distortions, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Also, the selection of senators was for, up until about a century ago, was decided by state legislators. All this was very deliberate. It was an effort to kind of filter out the popular perspectives. As this was being done, there was, again, this effort to bring the country in to respond to that consent of the governed idea, because whatever Madison and his friends put together in Philadelphia in 1787 would have to go back to the states to be ratified. So they were both trying to filter, but also respond and incorporate the expectations of the period. Now, one thing just to be really clear about, what I've just described, is mangled by race, because the democracy that was created was for white males, and women and people of color were excluded for generations, and then the consequences of that reverberate to our own time. Okay, I want to talk about three kind of assaults and departures from this Madisonian system of filters. which you may feel ambiguous about or ambivalent about. There may be parts of the filters sound good, like filtering out extremists, but also parts that may sound suspicious, like dampening down popular participation. And I think that ambivalence makes sense. But the theme I want to emphasize to you is that the idea, the commitment to institutional procedures and rules that would create a filter against demagogues has gone away. We've kind of lost that, and I think some of the reforms that were passed, and I'm going to roll through them quickly now, made some really ill-considered decisions. So the first stop on our quick historical tour is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, if you're not aware of him, was quite a character. And by the way, Donald Trump considers Andrew Jackson his favorite president. He's got a portrait. He likes to get his picture taken in front of Jackson's portrait. But Jackson rises to prominence as a general in the war against Britain in 1812. He is also, and this is a little less discussed, was a leader of the brutal murder of Native Americans and what's known as the Trail of Tears that uprooted tens of thousands of Native Americans from their homes in the East Coast. But he rises to national fame. He puts together a powerful party organization that sweeps him to power in 1828. He nearly tripled the turnout among eligible voters. And so this period is often described as a Jacksonian revolution because of Jackson's ability to mobilize voters. He also did something else, and I want to focus on this, though it often doesn't get as much attention, which is the institutional change that Jackson made by creating a national party convention of state delegates to choose presidential candidates. Now, put yourself in the period of the early 1820s, communication's not great, transportation is terrible, and so Jackson and his political strategist, Martin Van Buren, view the party convention as a way to mobilize voters behind a candidate and to grant the people the power to select the nominee. Maybe because they're really committed to democracy as they saw it, but also just for a very strategic, instrumental reason, which is they believed that, that Jackson would earn and attract support from voters if they saw themselves as the originators of that candidacy. All this, and I'm going to use a technical phrase, was bullshit. Jackson, as he's doing this, and Van Buren are talking openly about, oh yeah, we'll fix the convention, it'll never go to the people, but we'll be able to tell them it's their choice. Well, the key thing here, and this is really a kind of key point, is this is the beginning of this very American idea of equating democracy with the selection of candidates. This is not how democracy is defined in Europe and other countries. Democracy is defined in terms of the competition between parties, not the competition within parties. And this is really kind of if you're kind of sorting back, where did that idea come from? Jackson's a good place to start. Second deviation from Madison's concern about filters. Now, I just told you, Jackson, this kind of, democratizing force in the first quarter of the 19th century, pushes through the party convention and the power of the people in it, allegedly. Well, shoot ahead, 3/4 of a century to the late 1800s and early 1900s, and it's been taken over by the party machine. So if you think of Tammany Hall in New York, they're the ones who are controlling the party convention. And you get this rise of a reform movement known as the Progressive Era, and the progressives, and I mean from that period, not this period. The progressives looked at Jackson's handiwork and said, this was the end of American democracy. And so a lot of the fear that we've heard over the last months or years about American democracy being in decline, that was very much in vogue a century ago. The progressives saw particularly the takeover of the party conventions and what that meant for the power of the people to select their candidates, to challenge those in power, to break the trust of powerful economic interests at the forefront. And so they had this really cataclysmic view of the party machine as a threat to all that was good about American democracy. Now, the progressives had this very maximalist definition of the problem. American democracy was ending, and their solution was also very maximalist, which is the party organization needed to be radically changed, and control over who is being nominated needed to be stripped from their hands. And we get this idea of primary elections emerging, and one of the real chief advocates for this was a politician from Wisconsin named Robert La Follette. He was elected to the House, then elected governor, and then ran for president. He was a real progressive, genuine progressive force on a number of fronts, but probably his biggest kind of identity is with his promotion, his advocacy, before it was well known, of the primaries, a way to break the power of the corrupt party machines. Teddy Roosevelt in the 1912 battle over who was going to represent the Republican Party against Taft also embraced, became a kind of late fair weather fan of direct primaries, and he also embraced it. He said, or he asked, are the American people fit to govern themselves, to rule themselves, to control themselves? So that's, this is really like cosmic language, and it's all going to be solved by this direct primary. Something unexpected happened. Usually in America, when we have these moralist political movements crop up, we tend to see those movements succeed. Not the case, though, during the progressive era. Yes, 24 states did adopt it, and adopted it pretty quickly. But then the unexpected happened. Opposition rose up, and it stopped the direct primaries and actually rolled them back. And what I want to tell you is that the folks who were an important element, not the only element, but an important element in rolling it back, were reformers. These were reformers in the state and the local level who were experiencing the effect of direct primaries. And their criticism of the direct primaries, and I'll show you some of it, are so close to our criticism, or what should be our criticism of direct primaries today. And I just want to remind you, this is from a century ago. But by 1940, the direct primaries have been stopped in their path. So what were they saying? One set of criticisms was that the direct primaries were opening the door to pestiferous demagogues, I love that word, and brazen-faced men of a lower type of character. So these were corrupt people who were lying, who were using appeals to the people to get themselves elected, and then would pursue extremist agendas. The idea that the primary would give power to the people was widely derided as delusional. One of the kind of leading academic progressive forces, Henry Ford, who was at Princeton, he said this was nothing, this idea of the people having power through the direct primary was simply sentimental cant that thwarted the selection of the best for public office. And I would say, these criticisms ring true, at least to me, about where we are today. Now, one other thing, I've been mentioning race. Very important, I told you that the effort to expand the direct primary stalled by the 1920s and 30s, and by the 40s, it was really not a factor at all. But in the South, it was embraced, and it became known as the white primary. And the white supremacists loved the primary. Now, and here's one of many headlines about a white supremacist governor insisting that the primary remain. Why is that? Well, the 15th Amendment, as you remember, gave the power to African-American men to vote. So the white supremacists are like, okay, what are we going to do about that? They used the primary as a party organization. They would only let whites vote, and the whites would decide among the slate of candidates who they were going to support, and then they would all support that one candidate. And this system of using so-called white primary lasted for decades. There were Supreme Court rulings against it for obvious reasons, but it would last, from the 19-teens straight up until the civil rights legislation in the 1960s. So the kind of racist efforts and origins of the primaries well established. Now, here's the third deviation. The first was deviation from Madison's idea of let's have filters, let's be thoughtful about democratic procedures so that what is meant to be something for citizens isn't redirected by extremists and demagogues. That was Madison's core idea. We saw Jackson giving power to the party convention. Then we saw the progressives coming along with this idea of a direct primary, and I'm just going to use this word, delusional idea that this would give power to the people, and that was resisted. So what happened? Because now the direct primary is in control. 1968. 1968 was an incredible year, and part of the reason for that is the Democratic Convention in Chicago, where you had the convention meeting indoors, but outdoors you had thousands and thousands of students and protesters who were alarmed at the Vietnam War and the direction that America was going. The New Left, and particularly students coming off of campuses, were demanding a new form of democracy, participatory democracy, that would be outside the arena of electoral politics. And these are just some of the photos of this tremendous outpouring. Oh, the other thing Chicago is known for is that the mayor of Chicago, Daley, inspired what was referred to as a police riot. The police went and savagely beat up and in some cases seriously injured the protesters. Okay, so that's the 68. A small group of Democratic Party insiders, they were not necessarily, they didn't represent the party organization, but they were important elements in the party, got together and they used as a rhetorical justification the revolt in Chicago and the call for democracy. And one of those figures is George McGovern, who was the 1972 presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. McGovern was blocked by labor organizations and others who were dominant within the Democratic Party. And McGovern was looking for a way to marginalize those elements within the Democratic Party and boost his own chances by presenting himself as a genuine reformer. He needed the bona fides of being that reformer. He presented the direct primary. So the direct primary, as I said, was dead and sidelined, except in the South. And here's George McGovern and Fred Harris, who is a senator from Oklahoma, bringing it back to life. McGovern said that the primary would assure that the people, rather than the bosses, select presidential nominees. Without knowing it, McGovern is just kind of resurfacing the arguments that Robert La Follette and others had used decades before. The reality is that what McGovern was proposing was not in any way related to what the students and others who were protesting in Chicago had favored. They had favored participatory democracy. What McGovern was creating, what we now have, is this internal Byzantine process that is guided by a bureaucracy and really favors the factions within the party. Okay. And as you've been picking up, I think the story about how this happened is this quiet coup that occurred within the Democratic National Committee. And I've got to just be honest with you about this. As I was working on this project, I had been teaching with Walter Mondale for many years. And Mr. Mondale would often ask me, what are you working on? And I would tell him, you know, health reform or whatever. And when I started working on this project, and he asked me that question, as he did every so often, I told him. He said, let me know when you get to the 1960s. So I went and I said, okay, I'm now working in the 60s. He said, what do you know? And I told him this. I said, there was a coup at the DNC, and here's what happened. And he looked at me suspiciously. He said, how do you know that? You're not supposed to know that. And I explained the value of being a good researcher and interviewing people, and he laughed. And so, you know, Mondale confirmed a lot of this, you know, maneuvering behind the scenes by Fred Harris and George McGovern, who he was friends with, but really thought that McGovern's effort to revive the direct primary was a big mistake. Okay, so what? Okay, I'm not going to get one chuckle. Cute baby. Thank you. So one thing that happened as a result of this is that direct primaries lock in. There's like a tripling of the number of primaries, and it's now, you know, dictates presidential candidates and candidates for other offices. The other is that the rise of primaries after 1971 reforms by George McGovern have profound impact on the quality of our democracy that confirm the warnings of the progressive era critics. One is increased polarization. The deep divisions that the progressive critics warned about are with us, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. They have empowered narrowly based ideologues and extremists. And they have brought to the fore and given a nomination to those who are opposed to our Constitution, our rule of law, and the norms of governing that have been around for so long. There's a two-step process that's now going on in America. One is that small cliques of liberals and especially quite conservative advocates are determining who are the nominees in very low turnout primaries. I'm talking about in a presidential year, which is supposed to be, you know, the maximum participation, turnout is maybe a quarter or a third of the Democrats and Republicans in those years. For midterm election, it might be as low as 10 or 15%. When AOC won a primary against a well-established Democrat, the turnout in that district was 12%. So this is a very significant change. 12% of voters turned out. The other part is that, so you've got the extremists, particularly on the right, who are determining who's going to be nominated. Well, what about the general election? There used to be a thought that voters would make judgments based on the quality of candidates. Well, that's not actually what's going on. We've got the power. Remember I mentioned at the beginning about the power of the party? Well, the party loyalty locks in, and we are no longer seeing kind of these judgments about the quality of the candidate. Donald Trump famously and accurately, maybe, said that he could go on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and he'd still get the nomination. So the name of the game is win the nomination, and then you try to, and then you mobilize your party base. That gives you, you know, as I said, give you 40%, 45% of the electorate, and then you try to build enough vote support based on people who are disenchanted with the incumbent party or undecided and ready to kind of move on to a new candidate. So with Donald Trump, his deviation from our constitutional order is pretty well documented, inciting the January 6th storming, his false claims about massive election fraud, his threats of retribution against his opponents. These are kind of, among those who study the breakdown of democracy in other countries, we talk about kind of the violation of laws and rules, unilateral actions by presidents or other elected officials, and we talk about the breaking of governing rules, including tolerance, acceptance of difference, and Donald Trump clearly violates those. He's also supported anti-regime and fringe candidates and parties and organizations. We haven't seen this before, and it helps to explain why there was such a wide opposition to him among those with power. We've also seen the selection, the nomination of the 31 House Freedom Caucus members. Some of you may know who they are, but you will be reminded of them if you've forgotten. They are kind of libertarian, anti-government faction in the House of Representatives that's been empowered because of the very, very close division between the Democrats and Republicans. Republicans won 220 seats versus 215 for Democrats, but they had one member, Matt Gaetz, who stepped down. They've had two other members who have now been nominated by Donald Trump. They are not going to have a governing majority for some time in the House. So power is now going to shift into the Freedom Caucus, and they will be set to cause a lot of trouble. Republicans describe them as terrorists who want to burn the whole place down. I mean, that's their colleagues. And this is the key part. When you look at how did these Freedom Caucus members get elected, you see that about 3/4 of them were elected through primaries that were very narrowly, very low turnout, and where they would win with 30% or even sometimes a little less than that, with a lot of candidates. So the primaries are clearly enabling them to get elected. Hey, wait a second, I haven't talked about the Democrats. Well, I did tell you that McGovern had a big hand in bringing us back the primaries, but there's something else to be said, which is when we talk about demagogues and extremists, the Democratic Party gives us one of the really most searing examples of that. In 1972, this is the first election where the primaries and presidential election really mattered. One of the candidates running for the nomination of the Democratic Party for president was a guy named George Wallace. He was governor in Alabama. He was a segregationist. He was the one who famously said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Wallace was on track to win the Democratic nomination in 1972. He was struck down and paralyzed by an assassin and spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair. So he didn't finish the campaign. But if you look at his results, they were extraordinary and was clearly ahead of what we saw the eventual nominee, George McGovern, receiving. And what was George Wallace's campaign message? Well, a lot of it was violent and racist. There was a lot of angry populism present, and he very, expertly targeted the grievances of the financially vulnerable and politically disaffected white voter. So here we see right away in '72 the danger of a primary elections in which the party has no control over who's being nominated. Now, I would just add one other element, and I'll kind of try to wrap up, which is the primary has created this, this sense of the power of the people. It's elevated this expectation that citizens will control government. This is a myth. It's also kind of given this kind of energy to searching for a true popular sovereignty. This is something that Bernie Sanders talks about a lot. It's not a real reality-based notion. We could talk more about that. And this uninterrupted challenge to the representation of our system. The suspicion that the political process is absolutely riven through by corruption is rampant. It's not to say that corruption is not present, it is. But this idea that the democratic process is not worth fighting for in America is something that I think the direct primaries help to encourage. And again, this is a departure from the international standards and what we see in other countries which do not define democracy in terms of the selection of candidates internal to the party. Democracy is the battle between the parties. I mentioned that I work with Walter Mondale, who often said that it was important for those who cared about their country to speak up. And this is one of those times. And so if I'm standing here talking to you, particularly students, I'm telling you, we need you. Mondale said at the end of his memoir, I was raised in a community of decent, optimistic people. They thought politics means something, that the burden is lighter when we lift it together. And those values are with us today, but turning back the primary system is important. And let me just give you a few ideas on how that can be done. One is we need to restrain the primaries. I think we can increase the proportion of superdelegates at presidential conventions. And the idea is that those who are already elected, who are leaders, think of Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell, they have experience. They're focused on how do you win? How do you move your agenda of the whole party in a way that will attract voters, particularly the kind of swing voters? That kind of peer review would weed out extremists who appeal to the fringes. The Republicans have a winner-take-all primaries, and I would suggest we kind of encourage them to adopt proportional allocation. So Donald Trump would win a primary in a state by 4, 5, 6 points, he would get all the delegates. Whereas in the Democratic Party, the number of delegates is proportionate generally to how you do. We've seen nonpartisan primaries in California and Alaska, and that's something worth exploring. We need to know more about them, but that's certainly worth exploring. Do you feel like you vote all the time? I should see heads nodding, because in America, we're constantly voting. I actually sat down and tried to count it, and my graduate student and I spent weeks. There are about 500,000 contests. And okay, to be honest, a lot of these are like soil supervisor and water supervisor and so forth. Why are all those offices there? It's exhausting to be in America. In Germany or in Britain, the number of elections that voters are asked to participate in, a dozen or so. And in America, we're constantly voting, and it is exhausting, and it saps the civic energy of voters to learn about the candidates and to participate. It's one of the reasons we have such low turnout. Walter Mondale said, as I was reporting to him what I was finding, he said, yeah, I agree with you. We should have fewer really good elections that matter more to fight it out over the substantive debate between the parties. And that's what we have missed. You know, one thing I would say is we need critical thinkers, because so many of the things I've talked to you about, like the people having power, this is a fantasy. That's just not the way the world works. or this idea that direct primaries would be a solution, when in fact we know that they're empowering a small set of factions on the extreme, particularly on the Republican side, the ultra-conservative side. We need critical thinking about what does democracy mean at a point at which it's being used to justify primary elections that are not democratic, they're anti-democratic, and they are a threat to our laws and our Constitution. Let me stop there. We can get into a conversation. How does that sound?
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Jacobs. Yes, let's open it up to Q&A. Just a couple things to mention. If you want to keep the conversation going, we do have a few spots left at the luncheon. So if you'd like to join us for chicken parm and other options, please talk to me afterwards. We would love to have you. Also at 1:15 in Hasenstadt 109, the conversation will continue. Let's talk. What to expect in a second Trump administration. So those are other opportunities to keep the conversation going, but now we're gonna open up to Q&A. We're gonna include our Zoom friends, and we actually have one from Zoom right now, which is ranked choice voting versus primaries? That's the question.
Yeah. So I take a side because I love the energy going into thinking about reforms. I mentioned the nonpartisan primaries. I think that's very interesting. I'm worried about the ranked choice voting, and I'm cautious in saying that because I know so many people are passionate about it. It's being driven by the deep awareness of many of the things I'm talking about, the polarization, the empowering of extremists. But ranked choice voting is not that answer. And let me give you a couple reasons why I'm skeptical. One is, if you look at, as I have in my research and colleagues have, if you look at the promises of ranked choice voting advocates, such as, if we have a real election in which people aren't voting, negative way to block someone, but actually can vote for the candidate they support, this is going to expand participation. Well, that's not happening. There was talk about expanding the participation of voters of color. And that's not happening either. But I'm going to tell you my main concern about ranked choice voting. In political science, one of the iron rules, and to be honest, there are not many, is that all sorts of political participation is related to income and education and race. If you are white, better educated, and higher more affluent, you're more likely to vote, you're more likely to write and contact your member of Congress, you're more likely to turn out for meetings, on and on down the line. It's like every study is basically finding this. This is known as the social economic status gradient, or SES gradient if you're kind of in the know, which you all are now. Ranked choice voting reinforces that. Why does it do that? Because the collection of information on different candidates, the analysis of your position on those candidates and their positions is cognitively taxing. You have to have the time, you have to have the training, and the caring. So if you're given 3 choices for candidates, who's exercising them? Well, the research that I and colleagues have been doing around the country suggests that it fits the SES gradient. It tends to be those who are white, more affluent, better educated, who are taking advantage of those 3 candidates. And I haven't seen research on this, but I suspect that the accuracy of those rankings among those who are lower SES is probably not very strong. That's a general pattern that we see, that the information requirements are so stringent. So bottom line, I'm concerned that ranked choice voting is actually expanding political inequality. And while I 100% support the need for reform, it's part of this critical thinking. We need to ask, will this reform address that problem? And I have doubts.
Hi, my name is Cyrus. Thank you for coming to speak with us. I'm a political science major here, and This is definitely a very interesting perspective and one that I haven't heard a lot in my life nor at Carleton. I wanted to ask, at the beginning of your talk, you said something about how, whereas in Europe, the party leaders have a great amount of influence over, they decide who the nominees are, whereas in the United States, much less so. I would make the case, for example, in the 2020 Democratic primary, that the sudden joining of moderate forces to back Biden was an example of party leaders having a great influence, because as I saw it, it was an urgent move to block Bernie Sanders from getting the nomination, and that Biden in particular didn't have a lot of grassroots support behind him. And you could maybe argue that Buttigieg had more of that because he was actually coming up closer to Bernie in the other primary elections. And so I guess the way that I see that is that to me was an example of party leaders making that choice, even though Biden, I think, had already demonstrated to have a certain level of cognitive decline even in the 2020 primaries, which then led to him having a presidential administration that was perceived by many as ineffective because of the way that he presented himself. And I think, to me, that's an example of party leaders not being completely in touch with what the actual people will be interested in for general elections. And so he did manage to win 2020, but then not 2024. And I'm wondering if you're at all sympathetic to the idea that primaries are a good gauge for how people will then vote in the general elections, and that it's possible that party leaders are not super equipped to actually have their finger on the pulse of what people will vote for in the generals.
Do you have 15 minutes? That was an excellent set of points, and they deserve more attention I'm going to give to you. But I agree with you that in 2020, you saw the party groups, because there is not really a party organization. There's not, a head of the Democratic Party who can make these choices. But there are a coalition of groups, funders, groups representing different interests that coalesce. They're like a proto-coalition. And they did come to that conclusion with regard to Biden in 2020, and they kind of very quickly solidified. But it's not a party organization decision. And you can see, as you point out, that when you look at 2024, when it was clear to a large number of people, including in the party, that Joe Biden was not up to the task, there was no way to remove him. And that's the point. In Europe, he would have been removed. He would have been ushered off the stage, and probably in a more graceful manner than what ended up happening.
We're going to squeeze one more question in, and I believe our friend here has it.
Thank you so much for your talk today. Definitely very enlightening, different points of view. I have a question about going back to the whole ranked choice topic. What is your stance on the state of Washington in the fact that they do not hold in-person elections? They send out mail-in ballots to every single person registered to vote in the state with a full packet of information that is all the information that the candidates have supplied. What's your take on that?
Well, just in general, let me say two things. One is that I have founded and built the largest program to train election officials. So you think of Steve Simon as Secretary of State. The people who work for Steve Simon are the kind of people we're training. We have about 140 student enrollments now. So I'm very tied into what's going on among election officials and some of the reforms going on in the states. I like the fact that in some states you're automatically registered. I think the idea of universal mail-in ballots is very helpful because it makes it possible for more people to vote. We saw this, for instance,
around the pandemic where, people, because of their family life, but also the threat of COVID, had many more opportunities and more time to cast ballots. And guess what? Turnout went up. And we tend to see in Washington and Oregon and elsewhere that the turnout is pretty strong. Okay, so that's point one. Point two, I think the cognitive questions about we're going to give you a packet of information, read it, and then you can make a choice, it still runs up against the same problem, which is, I'm just going to say this, but I think most people here would get a packet of information, maybe the Saturday or Sunday before they're going to vote. They'd open it up, they would read through it. They're like, yeah, I know that candidate, but I didn't know this candidate. And that candidate's position on this topic is something I agree with or I don't agree with, so I'm going to support them or not. Those are kind of, it takes some effort to do that. You have to have, a Carleton education or familiarity with kind of analytic thinking. And that is just not evenly distributed among voters. There are folks who just don't have those skill sets. And this is not to talk down to people at all. It's just to acknowledge the reality that people come to our electoral processes with different sets of skills and capacities and interests. I've got some family members, if they get a thick packet of information on candidates, it's going to go in recycling or be, put in front of the dog bed so it doesn't get too wet in the wintertime. And that's my concern. That's where this social economic status gradient kicks in. And we tend to ignore it, but it is real. And again, I'm not a big promoter of the iron laws of political science, but that's one of them.
And I know we have lots more questions, but unfortunately time is up. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Jacobs, for being with us. Thank you all for being here. We'll see you next week.